The evening of September 24th began like any other Tuesday in San Antonio, Texas. But at 9:22 p.m., the routine quiet of a Southside neighborhood was shattered by a police dispatch that would set in motion one of the most disturbing investigations the city had seen in years. Officers were summoned to a modest single-story home, the kind of residence that blended seamlessly into the suburban landscape. The call was classified as a medical emergency, an unresponsive child. When the first officers arrived, they were met by the parents, Jonathan and Christina Miranda, who directed them toward the laundry room. What they found inside defied anything their training had prepared them for. A 10-year-old boy lay motionless. His body was small, far too small for a child his age. His skin clung to his bones in a way that suggested prolonged starvation. His face was marked with abrasions, his legs and feet covered in wounds. The officers immediately began CPR, their hands pressing against a chest that felt fragile, almost hollow. They worked desperately, but the boy's body did not respond. Within minutes, it became clear that Michael Miranda, for that was the boy's name, was gone. But as the officers looked at the scene around them, they understood that this was not a simple medical call. The condition of the child, the state of the room, the smell that hung in the air, all of it pointed to something far more calculated. The parents were still in the home. They were calm. They offered explanations that, in the coming hours, would begin to unravel. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the San Antonio Police Department would be building a case not for neglect, but for murder. When medical personnel and forensic investigators began documenting Michael's physical condition, the full scope of his suffering became impossible to ignore. The boy was 10 years old, but his body told a story of deprivation that spanned months, perhaps longer. He was emaciated, his frame so thin that every rib was visible beneath his skin. The medical term used in the autopsy report was malnourished, but that clinical language could not capture the horror of seeing a child reduced to what one investigator described as a skeleton barely held together by flesh. His face bore abrasions, scrapes and cuts that had never been treated. His legs and feet showed similar wounds, some fresh, others scarred over. But it was his back that revealed the most damning evidence. Bruises and trauma covered nearly every inch of his spine and shoulder blades, and these injuries were not uniform. Some were fresh, still purple and red. Others had faded to yellow and green, indicating they were weeks old. Still others had healed completely, leaving only scar tissue beneath the skin. This pattern told investigators something critical. The abuse had not been a single event. It had been ongoing, repeated, methodical. Michael had been beaten so many times that his body was covered in a map of violence, each layer of injury marking a different day, a different incident. When the diaper he was wearing was removed, investigators found sores on his buttocks and a condition known as severe rectal prolapse. His large intestine was bulging outside his body. The medical examiner would later discover fractured ribs in various stages of healing, damage to both femurs, a dislocated arm, and internal trauma to his neck. The preliminary cause of death was a lacerated lower intestine, an injury that could only have been caused by a punch, a kick, or being struck by an object with tremendous force. The laundry room where Michael was found became the focal point of the crime scene investigation. It was not a large space. In most homes, a laundry room is functional, perhaps cluttered, but essentially ordinary. This room was anything but ordinary. As investigators processed the scene, they documented dried feces scattered across the floor, not in small amounts but in quantities that suggested a human being had been using the space as a toilet for an extended period. The walls bore damage, broken drywall with holes that appeared to have been made by impact, as though someone had been thrown against them repeatedly. In one corner, positioned on the floor, was a training pad designed for pets. The pad showed signs of use, and investigators noted that it had been placed in a way that suggested a human had been directed to use it as a bathroom facility. But perhaps most chilling were the charts affixed to the walls. These were not ordinary household lists or reminders. They appeared to be checklists, tracking systems of some kind, with handwriting that documented tasks, behaviors, or compliance. The charts suggested organization, method, a system of control. Christina Miranda, when questioned by detectives, offered an explanation for Michael's presence in the laundry room. She said the boy had not been feeling well, and she and her husband had kept him there for a couple of days to monitor his condition. The evidence in the room told a different story. The accumulation of dried feces, the level of damage to the walls, the presence of the pet pad as a makeshift toilet. None of these were consistent with a confinement of only a few days. Police investigators came to believe that Michael had been kept in that laundry room not for days, but for roughly a year. A year of isolation. A year of filth. A year of being reduced to a series of checkboxes on a wall while the adults in the house went about their daily lives just feet away. The Miranda household contained 5 other children besides Michael. They ranged in age, all under 18, all homeschooled. When police interviewed these children, they were met with a cascade of disclosures that would provide the most direct evidence of what had happened inside the home. The children spoke haltingly at first, then with increasing detail. They described what they had witnessed happening to Michael, day after day, in the rooms and hallways they all shared. According to their statements, Michael was physically beaten every single day. The beatings were not spontaneous outbursts of anger. They followed a pattern. The parents used specific implements, a wooden paddle and a rubber paddle that contained a metal core inside it. These were not ordinary household items. They were tools, selected and maintained for a purpose. The children described watching their parents pick Michael up by his feet and throw him to the floor. They said this happened repeatedly, and it continued until Michael stopped moving, or until he stopped making sounds. They described Michael being forced to stand against a wall for hours at a time, his body held in place while he was struck in the torso with the paddle. As the children spoke, detectives noticed something that would later be documented in the police report. The children were afraid. Not of the police, not of the questions, but of their parents. When the interviews concluded, each child made the same request. Please do not tell our parents what we have said. These were children who had been removed from the home, who were in the custody of Child Protective Services, who were surrounded by adults whose job was to protect them. And yet, they still feared retaliation from the 2 people who had raised them. That fear, more than any physical evidence, revealed the atmosphere of terror that had governed their lives. The autopsy of Michael Miranda was conducted by the Bexar County Medical Examiner's Office, and the findings would provide the forensic foundation for the capital murder charges. The external examination alone was devastating. Michael's body showed signs of prolonged starvation, with his weight far below the normal range for a child his age. The abrasions on his face, legs, and feet were catalogued and photographed. The bruising on his back was mapped, with each injury noted for its size, location, and approximate age. The sores on his buttocks and the severe rectal prolapse were documented in detail. But it was the internal examination that revealed the full extent of the violence Michael had endured. The medical examiner found fractured ribs, multiple ribs. Some of the fractures were fresh, showing no signs of healing. Others were in various stages of healing, with calluses forming around the broken bone, evidence that those ribs had been broken weeks or months earlier and had been allowed to heal without medical treatment. Both of Michael's femurs, the large bones in his upper legs, showed damage. One of his arms was dislocated, the joint forced out of its socket. The medical examiner also found evidence of possible internal traumatic injury to Michael's neck, suggesting that his throat had been subjected to force. But the finding that would determine the cause of death was the condition of Michael's lower intestine. The medical examiner discovered a laceration, a tear in the intestinal wall, that had resulted in internal bleeding and infection. This injury, the examiner concluded, could not have been self-inflicted. It had to have been caused by an external force, a punch, a kick, or the impact of an object striking the boy's abdomen. This was the injury that killed Michael Miranda. It was not the result of illness. It was not the result of accident. It was, according to the medical evidence, the result of a deliberate act of violence delivered with enough force to rupture internal organs. When police took Jonathan and Christina Miranda into custody, the 2 parents were separated for questioning. Their responses to investigators could not have been more different. Jonathan Miranda, upon being seated in the interrogation room, listened as detectives explained why he was there. He showed no visible emotion. When the detectives began asking questions about Michael, about the laundry room, about the charts on the walls, Jonathan made a single statement. He wanted a lawyer. He said nothing else. He did not offer explanations. He did not express grief. He did not ask about his son. He simply invoked his right to remain silent, and the interrogation ended. Christina Miranda, questioned in a separate room, initially appeared more willing to talk. She told detectives that Michael had not been feeling well, and she and her husband had kept him in the laundry room for a couple of days to monitor his condition. She offered this explanation as though it were perfectly reasonable, as though keeping a 10-year-old boy in a room with dried feces and a pet pad for a toilet was a normal response to illness. The detectives, noting the evidence they had already seen in the laundry room, recognized that her statement was inconsistent with the physical reality of the scene. They pressed her for more details. How long had Michael really been in that room? What were the charts on the walls? Who had inflicted the injuries on his body? Christina Miranda, confronted with questions that grew increasingly pointed, did what her husband had done. She requested a lawyer. The interviews were over, but the silence of the parents spoke volumes. Neither Jonathan nor Christina Miranda asked about the other children. Neither asked about Michael. Neither expressed any curiosity about what had happened to the boy they had adopted. Their only concern, once they were in custody, was protecting themselves from the consequences of what had occurred inside their home. As the investigation unfolded, a defense attorney representing Jonathan Miranda in a related Child Protective Services proceeding made a statement to local media that added a new dimension to the case. The attorney, who was not handling the capital murder charges, spoke to a television station and offered a version of events that diverged sharply from the police narrative. According to the attorney, Michael Miranda had not entered the Miranda home as a healthy, stable child. He said the boy had been suffering from a pre-existing physical and behavioral condition, one that originated from a prior brain tumor. He said Michael would engage in self-destructive behaviors, including banging his head against walls. He said the boy could be aggressive toward people in the household. The attorney's statements carried an unmistakable implication. Some of the injuries Michael sustained may not have been caused by his adoptive parents. Perhaps the fractured ribs, the bruises, the damage to his body were the result of his own actions, a consequence of the medical condition that plagued him. Perhaps the parents were not abusers, but overwhelmed caregivers struggling to manage a child with profound needs. This defense strategy, if pursued at trial, would require expert witnesses. The defense would need to find medical professionals willing to testify that Michael's injuries were consistent with self-harm. They would need to establish a timeline showing that the brain tumor and its behavioral effects predated Michael's placement in the Miranda home. They would need to convince a jury that reasonable doubt existed, that it was possible, even if not probable, that Jonathan and Christina Miranda were not responsible for their son's death. The prosecution would respond with their own experts, who would testify that the lacerated intestine, the starvation, the confinement in the laundry room could not be explained away by a brain tumor. The battle, when it came, would be fought with medical records and expert testimony. The 5 other children who lived in the Miranda home occupy a complex position in this case. They are witnesses, they are victims, and they are, in many ways, the key to understanding what happened to Michael. Their statements to police provided the most detailed account of the daily abuse Michael endured. They described the wooden paddle and the rubber paddle with the metal core. They described being thrown to the floor. They described standing against the wall for hours. They described beatings that occurred every day. These are not the recollections of adults recalling distant events. These are the memories of children who watched their brother suffer, who lived in the same house, who heard the sounds of violence and learned to be silent. If this case goes to trial, the prosecution will face a difficult decision. The children's testimony is powerful. It is direct evidence. It comes from people who were there, who saw what happened, who can tell a jury what life was like inside that home. But putting children on the witness stand in a capital murder trial means asking them to relive their trauma in a courtroom filled with strangers. It means seating them within feet of the parents they still fear. It means subjecting them to cross-examination by a defense attorney whose job is to challenge their credibility, to ask them questions designed to create doubt, to suggest that their memories are flawed or their perceptions incomplete. For the defense, cross-examining a child witness requires extraordinary skill. An attorney who appears too aggressive risks alienating the jury. An attorney who appears too sympathetic risks failing to effectively challenge the testimony. The children, in their police interviews, asked that their parents not be told what they had said. That request, more than any piece of physical evidence, captures the psychological reality of life in the Miranda household. These children were afraid, and that fear will shape every decision made about their participation in the legal process.